Hello and welcome back to Bokrim. I'm Tim Jaggs, I'm Bokrim's founder. In this video I want to talk briefly about what is a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. And the reason I want to talk about that is that it's a question I get asked a lot. People want to know, what is it, why does it matter, and how do I develop and maintain one given how important you say it is. So let's talk briefly about what it is first. And I want to use an example so that you understand. I hope this will help you understand it. I want you to think back to the last time that you took a major decision. And it might have been about buying a car or buying a house or changing a job, but it's a significant decision. You have an interest in this decision and the outcome is somewhat uncertain. The car may or may not prove to be ideal for you. The house might turn out to be in a bad area or bad neighbours, or the point is that there are a number of different uncertainties that could affect the outcome that you're looking to achieve, which is to end up being happy with your new car, happy with your new home, or succeeding in a new job. Lots of different things can impact the result of that, or can impact the objective that you're hoping to achieve. And what you'll have done is you'll have thought carefully about the pros and cons. You'll have looked at what could potentially go wrong, and you'll have taken steps to try to make sure that the outcome you're hoping to achieve is as positive as possible, and that the opportunities for things to go wrong and for adverse outcomes to occur is minimized as much as possible. And what I've just described there is the essence of risk management best practice. It's when you face a key decision, you look for information that helps you make a good decision, you identify the uncertainties that could impact the achievement of your objectives, you take steps to make sure that based on the decision you've taken, actions follow that aim to ensure that the outcome that you're looking for is as positive as you hope it's going to be. And broadly speaking, once you've got everybody in your organization understanding and identifying when they see a sexual abuse risk-related issue they need to make a decision about, they understand the information that they need to collect, they understand the decision that they need to take, and they understand what actions they need to take following whatever decision it is that they take. Once you've got everybody in your organization in that position, then you have a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. And the reason it's so important is that organizations that use traditional risk management that aren't focused on developing a culture, compared to organizations that use risk management best practice, which is specifically designed to establish exactly the kind of culture I've just described, organizations using risk management best practice, it's an approach called ERM, they have fewer and less expensive adverse events like sexual abuse. They are more trusted by their stakeholders. They're also incidentally more valued by their stockholders. They pay less to borrow and to insure, and they achieve their objectives more often than organizations using traditional risk management. So that's why it's so important. The benefits so significantly outweigh, or the benefits are so significant, there is no question that it is a more effective approach to managing risk. And risk management best practice, its entire focus is on ensuring that an organization has a risk-aware culture. And so the development of a sexual abuse risk-aware culture is the way to keep sexual abuse minimized as much as possible and the harms that it causes as limited as possible. It's also absolutely critical to sexual abuse risk management. It's also the way that if you're using risk management best practice, it's the way you're going to be convincing when somebody turns around to you and says, okay, how are you looking after the children in your care? And you can turn around and say, well, we're using best practices and here's how we're using them. And we know they are the best practices because we've got these practices from places that we trust. And we've gone through the process in creating our system and ensuring that everybody has this culture. We've gone through the process of understanding what we're trying to achieve. We've gone through the process of identifying what decisions we need to make. We've found the right information and we've taken steps to set ourselves on the right path And we've followed that process logically down from the top of the organization, deciding that we're going to manage sexual abuse risk using best practices. And we've got that whole decision-making idea spread out throughout the whole organization with respect to sexual abuse risk. That's what creating and maintaining a sexual abuse risk-aware culture is all about. Hope that was a good or helpful introduction. What I'd like to do now is to go into a bit more detail to talk about what it is, just to refine that slightly and show you what it can look like and show you, talk through some of the pitfalls. What can often happen is that you move from not having a risk-aware culture to having one at the leadership level, but not necessarily managing to permeate through the whole of the organisation. Other organisations do manage to get a sexual abuse risk-aware culture throughout their organisation, but they don't then maintain it, and it shrinks back into just the leadership having that culture. I'll also talk briefly again, I'll remind you about why it matters. But what I'm also going to concentrate on is to talk about how you develop and absolutely critically how you maintain it. And that's what we're going to talk about moving on now. So let's talk about, remind you again of what it is. And the idea is that by the end of these slides, you'll have a series of screenshots when you can come back and watch these slides anytime you like. But you'll also have a series of screenshots that will help you remind you of what I've been talking about. So the sexual abuse risk-aware culture happens when everyone working with or for your organisation understands the risks that you're dealing with, and those are risks in 3 different areas, and they need to understand all of these. And you'll understand why this is important later in this video. But first of all, they need to understand the risks of sexual abuse to minors and vulnerable adults, the harms or how often it can happen, the different ways in which sexual abuse can happen, and the harms that can be caused to minors and vulnerable adults. I'm not going to go into the details of any of those things here or these other things. I'm merely trying to give you some of the main points to think about. But everybody understands these risks. Secondly, they also understand the risks to your organisation. Organisations that have sexual abuse incidents lose revenues fairly early on because people stop doing business with them or stop using them for whatever services they're using them for. They may also have legal liabilities, which can lead to large settlements or jury awards, and they have the long-term drain in their income, or their revenue, I should say, over an extended period of time that can impact the ability to deliver on their mission, for example, if you're a non-profit. So the financial consequences are fairly significant, but what's often forgotten is that the disruption to the organisation, the damage to its reputation, and the various different legal liabilities, all of these things can add up to a very, very significant set of risks and consequences if sexual abuse happens. The other thing to bear in mind with sexual abuse is that thinking about what we talked about when you go to buy a car, you're not worried about so much the downside as are you going to achieve your upside. Organisations that manage sexual abuse risk well, we'd like to see them succeeding more than organisations that aren't, because, for example, if an organisation is trusted to look after kids well, it should, all other things being equal, have more kids to look after than an organisation that doesn't look after kids so well. It should also, because it has more kids, let's say it's a sports organisation, it should be able to field more and better teams and therefore be more competitive. So we don't see sexual abuse risk management just about preventing adverse events, but supporting the achievement of the objectives that your organisation has. And that's a key part of understanding what risk management best practice is all about. The third set of risks that you need to understand are the risks to you yourself. If you are somebody who works with or for an organisation, you potentially face risks related to sexual abuse. And I'm not suggesting for a second that you're a perpetrator, you're going to abuse a child. What I'm talking about is you're trying to protect them, and despite doing everything you can to protect them, sexual abuse nonetheless happens. And when that happens, there are or can be some very significant consequences for you. There's the same disruption, there's the same reputation damage, there's also the harm to your psyche and the shame that you'll feel for if people tell or say often enough, well, you should have and could have done more to protect these kids. Whether you could or should isn't so much the point, as they will be constantly telling you that, and you'll come to believe that. So you need to think about how you're going to address that risk. There's also the financial risk. If your career is ruined because of the reputation damage, because you've been dragged through the courts, for example, and your name's been publicly splashed all over the press, that's going to have a significant long-term impact on your ability to work. So there are risks to you as individuals as well. The next area, once you've got the risks, the next is to look at the various different controls that are in place or not to take care of sexual abuse. And the first set of controls are those that are used to prevent, identify and respond to sexual abuse. I'm going to start, as I talk through this video, I'm going to start talking about the safe environment. And I'm going to start making comparisons with risk management best practice and the safe environment. And I'll give you some advance warning now. I'm going to be rude about the safe environment. Broadly speaking, the safe environment, it was deliberately limited by design when it was first produced or first introduced over 20 years ago. So the reason it was deliberately limited was that the Catholic Church who introduced it wanted to make sure, or they had to produce something quickly, and they had to make sure that every single organisation in a very diverse church was able to implement it. And the diversity included not just different activities, but different resources and different experience. And so it had to be something that any organisation, however little their resources and however limited their risk management experience, could implement. So it had to be really easy, really simple to implement, and really quick to implement. And for that reason, it was extremely limited. It, broadly speaking, only has 3 controls: criminal background checks, policies and procedures around one-to-one interactions, although that can be several pages long because it can be one-to-one interactions in a particular place, while travelling, while lodging, while doing all sorts of different things. But they're all different versions of policies and procedures around one-to-one interactions, which broadly means adults shouldn't be alone with children. The last area is training, and some of the training is candidly much better than others. I'm not saying that background checks, policies and procedures and training aren't important, but on their own, they are grossly inadequate at preventing sexual abuse. For example, if you think about the application or the process you would go through to get a job flipping burgers, you'd have to you'd have to complete an application form, you'd have to go for interviews, and you'd have probably more than just a criminal background check to make sure that you could get that job. And already what I've described to you in one area, and it's the same in the other 2, is that there is more required of somebody flipping burgers than there is of somebody who's going to go and work with minors and vulnerable adults. And that's completely crazy. Many organisations, I should say very quickly here, many organisations do supplement the safe environment, but far from all organisations do. Many organisations that we've worked with and met with over time don't do anything more than the criminal. They basically bring in volunteers into their organisation of people they already know, or they're a friend of a friend. The only check that they do is a criminal background check, and then that person is in. That is not enough to keep children safe. So that was a slight diversion. You'll hear me being very rude about the safe environment as we go on. I've just talked about how it's limited. The second issue is that it's, the second major issue is that it, when it was put together, the people that put it together didn't think about and basically ignored the critical importance of continuous improvement. And so the safe environment, it was pretty limited when it was very limited when it started, and it's not changed, broadly speaking. It's still the same 20 or more than 20 years later, and it wasn't risk management best practice even 20 years ago or 22 years ago, so it's arguably 30 years out of date, and it's certainly 2 and maybe 3 generations of risk management best practices behind the times. Like I said, I'm going to be rude about it, and I'm not going to apologise about that. Limited by design, out of date. The third is, and the most important as far as I'm concerned, is that it doesn't, and it contains none of the elements required to establish, never mind maintain, a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. So I'll jump off my soapbox now and carry on with these controls. The second set of controls are that and everybody working with or for the organisation, actually I missed a point I should have made earlier on, this question of with or for. It's not just full-time employees, it's not even full plus part-time and maybe volunteers. It's anybody that works with or for the organisation. So for example, it could be parents. And quite often will be parents. You would consider them as working with your organisation in many instances. That wouldn't apply to every organisation for sure. There might be various other types of caregiver or guardians that we might be talking about and not parents. But the point is that the idea of the sexual abuse risk-aware culture extends beyond the boundaries that are traditionally understood to be what constitutes the organisation. And it's critical to understand that distinction, because the culture of who needs to know what the risks are and what's been done about them needs to expand beyond the boundaries of the organisation. This question of how people are expected to behave, this is about understanding that certain forms of language are inappropriate. Drinking alcohol may be inappropriate, and so on. This isn't about the next stage, which is what we talked about at the very beginning, which is the idea that there are certain decisions and actions that must be taken, are required in certain key situations. So what you're seeing is that everybody understands what's generally been done to prevent, identify and respond. They also know how they're all expected to behave, and critically at the top of this little pyramid, they understand that there are certain points where decisions have to be taken, actions follow those decisions, and in those particular situations there is no pass and go. You have to stop, consider the situation and decide if if it meets some criteria or not, and if it does, actions follow. And ideally you get, once you've got everybody who works with or for your organisation who is at the point where they can make those decisions because they understand the risks, because they know the general controls in place to prevent, identify and respond, and because they understand how they are expected to behave, they also know exactly what needs to happen when certain decisions need to be taken. Doesn't end there though, because the idea of continuous improvement is extremely important. And the continuous improvement, let's just talk about why it matters. There are, broadly speaking, 3 reasons. The first is that sexual abuse is rising. We need to make sure that sexual abuse not only stops rising, but starts falling. And somehow we've got to get to that, and we are so far behind the 8 ball in terms of preventing sexual abuse at the moment, because we're using the safe environment, or at least I think probably 95% or more of organisations are using the safe environment. And personally, I don't think there's any coincidence whatsoever in the idea that 95 or 98% of organisations are using a single system and sexual abuse is rising. Just to put that in context, adult on child sexual abuse has doubled, according to the largest private insurer of schools in the country, and child on child sexual abuse has increased 5 times. So it really matters that we get a lot better at preventing sexual abuse. The second reason is the question of stakeholder expectations. There was if I describe one example of how that's changing, and you may not think of a jury as a stakeholder in your organisation, but believe me, they are in the event that you have to deal with one. A large sexual abuse settlement 10 years ago might have been $250,000. The biggest at that time was probably in the region of $4 or $5 million. These are for individual victims of relatively current or recent abuse. 2 months ago in New Mexico, the value of the largest individual victim jury award for abuse, in this case that was committed or sustained in 2017, was $485 million. Stakeholder expectations are changing because the plaintiff's attorney, after the award was announced and standing outside the courtroom, said basically what the jury wanted to say was, first of all, that this little girl shouldn't have had this happen to her, and secondly, organisations cannot continue to manage this risk as badly as this organisation did, and we've had enough. And so there was a large part of the award was aimed at saying, for goodness sake, stop what you're doing, start protecting these kids properly. So continuous improvement is absolutely critical going forward. How it happens is part of the system that I'm going to describe in a minute. We call it BRM, but it's the idea that there is a systematic approach to identifying how well things are being done in an organisation. There is then a systematic approach to continuously improving the system, but also continually improving the culture by making sure that you enable everybody who works with or for the organisation to contribute to understanding of the risks, to developing the controls, and ensuring that all of those things, and that particularly the decisions that when they need to be taken, are clear, people understand what they need to do, and that the decisions are taken. I'll come back to a bit more about the continuous improvement later, but what I've done here is basically refine the idea of what does a sexual abuse risk-aware culture look like. And the point about all of this is that it's practical. This is potentially, you can turn this into a smart set of objectives. You can make sure that everybody understands, and you can test that everybody understands the risks, because you can make it explicit. You can make sure that everybody understands what the controls are to prevent, identify and respond. And you can make sure that when people don't behave as expected, there are consequences for that, and you can measure how often those consequences have to be applied. So the point is, this is all practical stuff that you can do in any organisation. It's not a nice idea and we'll kind of figure out how it goes, how to do it. This is all practical. But what does it look like in terms of the impression that you have once you've successfully got it in place? And where are many organisations where are they going to start from, and where are they going to try and get to? What I've got here is just a quick example of a high school org chart. Your high school may be different, and you may be a church, you may be a sports club, so this won't be relevant. The idea is simply to show an org chart. And that what often happens with sexual abuse risk management is that an individual in one department is given the responsibility of checking the boxes in the safe environment that everybody's been criminally background checked, everybody's watched a video every couple of years on training, and there is a set of policies and procedures keeping itself warm in a filing cabinet somewhere, and that they are therefore, that organisation is therefore complying with the safe environment. I've been very rude again there about the safe environment, but what I've also done is suggest that organisation doesn't care about minors and vulnerable adults. And I just want to make one thing really, really clear, because it's one of the cognitive biases that we absolutely need to address, and that's part of what having the right culture is all about. But one of the cognitive biases that absolutely needs to be addressed is that if I work for an organisation, I can't conceive of committing abuse myself, and I can't believe that anybody else I know and trust could commit abuse either. So when I'm working for an organisation that has the individual that's just making sure that we do everything appropriately from a compliance point of view, I sort of understand it, because there's no world I can imagine where sexual abuse is going to happen in an organisation I'm involved with. And I genuinely cannot get my head around the idea that it could happen. And it's not just that nobody likes talking or thinking about sexual abuse. We can't believe that people we know could behave any differently in this kind of respect, and so abhorrently to what we would think was reasonable behaviour. So it becomes very difficult. So many organisations very quickly fall into this trap where they just assume that everybody is going to be decent because they are. And unfortunately, that's not the way sexual abuse works. So what happens is that one individual in one department is responsible for ticking the boxes, but that's broadly it. There is no sexual abuse risk-aware culture. And if I say I've seen this structure of this non-existence of a culture, I've seen this in individual sports clubs of maybe 10 people, but I've also seen it in large institutions of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. You have one person who's in the finance department who's making sure that the boxes are ticked, and it's a fairly significant part of their role, because that's quite a lot of criminal background checks. It's quite a lot of training that they have to check that everybody's watched, and there's quite a lot of chasing up to make sure that everybody does it, because there's always a pocket of people that just think that the rules don't apply to them. So it's not an insignificant task for that person, but it does absolutely nothing to establish a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. The second stage of a sexual abuse risk-aware culture is that it's beginning because leadership has got it. They've understood the importance of culture because they're leaders, and they've got the experience of understanding that organisations with a positive culture achieve more. And so in terms of including sexual abuse risk awareness in the organisation's culture, they understand the benefits of doing that. And so what you see is that across the top of the org chart, people have got it. And then in some of the key service areas, particularly those that are most likely to be impacted by sexual abuse, so HR, finance, legal, IT, you'll see that they also understand what sexual abuse risk aware, what sexual abuse is all about. They understand the decisions they need to take, and they understand what actions they need to take if a certain decision is taken. But it doesn't. But that sense of understanding the decisions that need to be taken doesn't spread elsewhere in the organisation. Whereas, where there is a fully sexual abuse risk-aware culture, the culture exists not just within the boundaries of the organisation, but spreads well outside, so that you have everybody working with or for the organisation understanding what the risks are, what the controls are, what's expected of them, and what's required of them. What you often see, and this is a sort of a caveat here about some organisations are successful at developing a culture, but over time they don't look after it, they don't nurture it, and so you can have this culture, but then it falls back to this, and it's one of the big dangers that organisations face. Is we spend a lot of time and energy establishing a risk-aware culture, but you've got to maintain it. You've got to work on that to make sure that it's maintained. Once you've got it, it takes much less work to maintain it, but you nonetheless need to put that work in. So let's move on, and I'm just going to talk about the big difference. Let's move myself out of the way because I know I'm about to be in the way of these bullet points. I just want to talk about the difference between current sexual abuse risk management, and it's an opportunity to be rude about the safe environment again. And secondly, I'm going to talk then about the future of sexual abuse risk management, which is all about using enterprise risk management, or ERM, which is risk management best practice, which we've adapted for sexual abuse risk. And we've adapted it so that small organisations with very limited risk management experience and no real risk management knowledge are able to use risk management best practices by creating a body of knowledge that is accessible to everybody trying to manage this risk, and that means that everybody constantly has the information they need to make decisions through the process of implementing sexual abuse risk management best practice, which we also enable by providing access to an online application. I'm getting ahead of myself because that's part of the advert that comes later, so I'll try not to put too many more adverts in here. But let's talk about current sexual abuse risk management. And again, it's about this coincidence issue. Currently, more than 95% of organisations use the safe environment strategy. and I don't think it's any coincidence that in the last 10 years, sexual abuse has doubled. Adult on child has gone up, has doubled itself. Child on child sexual abuse has actually gone up 5 times. But also, all of the costs of not being able to prevent sexual abuse have risen exponentially. I've already given you a financial example. Another one is that where 20 years ago, every single sexual abuse incident would have been covered by an NDA. Nobody knew what was going on and no names were ever mentioned, victims or perpetrators, or the people that should have done and could have done and maybe didn't do everything they could have done to keep the kids safe. Today, an NDA isn't going to happen because you're going to get a criminal investigation by law enforcement in most circumstances of current abuse. They're going to investigate, and they're not just going to investigate the perpetrator and make sure that that there aren't any other victims. They're also going to check whether anybody else in the organisation effectively helped or enabled the abuse to take place because of things they didn't do or things that they should have done and didn't do, or the way that they willfully ignored what they actually saw, did nothing about it. So people have now the concern that not only are there civil liabilities potentially down the track for the organisation, there are potentially criminal liabilities to individuals. At the same time as their name is now in the public domain, maybe not immediately through law enforcement because they won't necessarily reveal names, but people in the local community will know who's being investigated, and that stuff can stick. The criminal investigation can last up to 2 years. That would be a long investigation, but that's how long it can be. The civil litigation that will likely follow the criminal, because that's normally the way it goes, the civil litigation can last up to a further 5 years. So instead of everybody being covered by an NDA and nobody knowing what's going on and lawyers probably sorting it out in a darkened room somewhere, maybe after 6 months or a bit longer, you've now got potentially 7 years of very public humiliation and concern over whether you might face criminal charges and then whether you might face civil charges, or the destruction of your reputation, all while your life is being turned upside down while all of this is going on. The consequences of not being able to prevent sexual abuse have changed and they've risen exponentially. Risk management best practice is all about trying to establish the risk-aware culture that would address all of the issues that we're talking about in these consequences and how they've exponentially risen. And I'll explain how that works slightly later on. But what we're looking to do is to make sure that organisations and the people working for them have a way of being convincing when they explain to people that they've done everything they could to keep children safe. Well, let me put it another way. We enable an organisation and the people working for the organisation to tell a story. And that story is, we looked at where minors and vulnerable adults were potentially exposed or vulnerable to sexual abuse. We designed and chose a set of controls that addressed all of those situations, and we used risk management best practice to make sure that we were keeping those. We implemented risk management best practice to ensure we had a system to maintain those controls in view of the changing nature of those vulnerabilities. And here's us doing what we said we would do. Here's the exposure, here's the controls we put in place, here's us using the controls. That's the story we enable you to tell, and it's a convincing story that you can explain to anybody at any time that you're using the best practices to prevent minors and vulnerable adults. It also deals with the legal liability issue because it creates defensibility. You're now demonstrating that you have been conscientiously protecting minors and vulnerable adults. Far from doing criminal background checks, having a policy and procedure around one-to-one interactions and making sure everybody watches a video every year, you've got evidence that you went through a risk assessment, that you've identified where all the exposures are, you've implemented controls for all of those exposures, and you've made sure those controls were happening over the long term. It's a completely different story in terms of how do you defend yourself in court, because the two you can see are chalk and cheese. Night and day. So, sorry, a slight divergence there. I said at the beginning that the reason that you have the risk-aware culture is so important is that organisations using ERM compared to organisations using traditional risk management, and another opportunity to be rude about the safe environment. The safe environment is a step down even from traditional risk management. So these comparisons are for a form of risk management that is superior, significantly superior to the safe environment, and they have fewer and less adverse events than even the superior version of risk management compared to the safe environment. Their adverse events cost less. They are more trusted, a critical element of sexual abuse risk management. They pay less to borrow and insure, and they are more highly valued by their stockholders, if that's relevant. One thing it should have said there, and I noticed there's a bullet point missing, is that they achieve their objectives more often as well, because the ERM is all about, and I'm going to come to that actually in the very next slide, ERM defines risk not as the possibility of an adverse event and its potential consequences, but it describes risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So what they're constantly doing, thinking back to that decision we talked about at the very beginning, what they're doing is identifying points in time when decisions need to be taken and actions need to be taken based on those decisions that make it as likely as possible that you will achieve the objectives you're heading for. So I want to talk now briefly, I hope that's all been helpful, but I want to talk about not so much being rude about the safe environment anymore, although obliquely I am, because what I'm talking about here is the 6 key elements that are essential in order to be able to develop a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. And all of these elements are missing from the safe environment. So, point 1 is that it's goal-oriented. I've already described how the safe environment defines risk management best practice, ERM, defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. What I'm about to say here is going to be heresy for many people, because many people will think that it should be enough for most people that they should want to do everything they can to protect minors and vulnerable adults. Then that should be all of the incentive anybody would need to establish and maintain a sexual abuse risk-aware culture and ensure that the protection of minors and vulnerable adults was always as optimized as possible. I don't know if you remember, and I don't know quite how it was dealt here. I've not lived in the US for long enough, but when I was living certainly back in the UK and in Canada, there was a time when governments there were doing their utmost to stop people from smoking. And in the UK, they had terrible stories of all of the orphans that were, or the kids that were left as orphans when their parents died of smoking. And in Canada, they went a step further and printed on the side of the box these horribly gory images of diseased lungs, which quite unpleasant. And I'm sorry to give you that image, but the point was they made absolutely no difference to people giving up smoking. People who smoked, and I was one at one time, I knew it was bad for me, but I didn't think it was going to catch up with me. I didn't think I was going to pay the consequences. It's other people it was going to happen to. And the same applies to sexual abuse. Nobody believes it's going to happen in their organisation, as I described earlier. And so you have a situation where we need to figure out a way to get people to understand and to take on board the need to manage sexual abuse risk that isn't just about preventing sexual abuse. Because as much as it's heresy, as I said, as much as it's heresy to say that protecting children isn't enough, protecting children isn't enough for many people to do all of the things that are necessary to actually keep children safe. And like I said, it's not about the people not wanting to keep children safe. They do want to keep children safe. There's absolutely no question. They have the cognitive bias, however, that they simply can't believe it's going to happen to them. And so they carry on doing what they're doing. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been with this organisation for 10 years, for 20 years. It never happened here and it never could. I hear it all the time. And those are precisely the places where there's the shock and horror when it actually does happen. So we make it goal-oriented. And that's what understanding the risks is all about when we if you remember the list of things that go into making a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. It's not just what the risks are to the kids, because everybody knows that already. It's not just the risk to the organisation, because again, people, okay, I'll be very sorry if my organisation suffered, but I could get over that. What I don't want is the negative effects on me. And so we do spend quite a lot of time emphasising that there is the possibility of quite significant adverse consequences on the people that work for or with organisations if they don't do everything they can to keep children safe. And what we then provide is the mechanism for people to do that. But so we make it goal-oriented. Now, in terms of the big decisions, this sexual abuse is something that's important to you because you definitely want to keep kids safe, and there is something in it for you when you do it well. And that's not just the avoidance of adverse outcomes. We're also thinking about how the organisation does better, and that obviously helps you. If you're again, I come back to the sports club analogy because it's the easiest one. The more kids you can get into your sports club, the more teams you can put out, and the chances are the more competitive they're going to be. So that's point one, make it goal-oriented. The second element is that it must be customizable. One size does not fit all, as you can see perfectly plainly from the dreadful failure of the safe environment to keep children safe. That is one size, and it's not working. Organisations need to be able to do what they need to do based on their risks. And again, part of that is that it's goal-oriented. If the organisation's objectives are whatever they are, that means they've got certain risks and they need to customise their system for those risks, but they need to understand what those risks are. So in the customisable stage, what we're talking about here is going out and performing a risk assessment, which involves understanding your organisation, understanding where the vulnerabilities are to sexual abuse, and understanding what resources you've got available that you can now think about using for the next stage, which is the comprehensive controls. And what you're thinking in this stage is, how do we choose controls that address all of the vulnerabilities we've identified? And also, how do we put controls in place that address our risks, both to the organisation and to us personally? Now, though, you can be comprehensive about them. We reckon that there's probably about 50 different controls, maybe more. Certainly, it's comfortably 50 that you could choose to with which to prevent, identify, and respond to sexual abuse. And yet, there are only 3 in the safe environment. Number 4 is that the whole system, clues in the name, you need a systematic approach. A system in its crudest sense means that here is a thing that has an objective and it's got the ability to achieve its objective, but it also needs a feedback loop to make sure that it keeps on track to meet that objective. The best known one is the heating thermostat. It's the same with the sexual abuse risk management system. You've got to make sure that the goals change, so you need to change the how you comprehensively address what's now changed about the risks in the customizable stage. So to keep everything in sync, you need a system that's constantly looking at that stuff. The system also needs to include additional elements like making sure that the actual controls are happening, making sure that you have a way of responding to incidents. So you need an incident response plan, and you may want to plan for change, not just identify that change has happened, but for example, you may decide that you're going to, I'm going to keep with the sports club analogy. You deal with 8 to 10-year-olds, and you're now going to deal with 10 to 15-year-olds. That's a different set of kids with a different set of issues around sexual abuse risk. So you need to plan for how you're going to deal with that, because you're going to have new vulnerabilities to sexual abuse that you need to deal with. The system also needs to be adaptable. I've kind of taken half of what I was about to say in this adaptable stage, because it needs to be adaptable to change. It needs to be adaptable to the idea that inside issues will change, external factors will change, and the system must be able to be adaptable. And that means you need to be able to easily pull out one element and plug in another as you go along. And if you need to adapt your incident response plan, you can do it quickly. And lastly, I've already talked about how important continuous improvement is. You cannot develop a successful system unless it includes continuous improvement. That all adds up to developing a sexual abuse risk-aware culture. The elements that I've just described there, the 6 elements that I describe, they do not exist in a safe environment. And so when I talked earlier on about today's risk management, sexual abuse risk management, and the future of sexual abuse risk management, in order to deal with the scale and scope of sexual abuse risk as it now is, having doubled in the last 10 years in terms of frequency, and having with all the costs having risen exponentially, there is no argument in my mind that every organisation must use risk management best practices, not just because it's going to stop sexual abuse from rising, but because that's the only way organisations can protect themselves from the consequences of not being able to prevent sexual abuse, and it's the only way the individuals who work with or for that organisation can protect themselves from those same consequences, but applied to them individually in ways that their organisation can't help them with. So, those are the elements. So let's move on to the last stage of this video, in which I'm going to talk just very quickly, because I'm probably testing your patience now. I'm going to talk about the risk management, or the system that you need to put in place to manage sexual abuse risk using risk management best practices. I've talked briefly, I think, about the idea that risk management best practice is an approach called enterprise risk management, or ERM. ERM is designed for large, sophisticated organisations that are able to invest significant resources in a risk management function. And most organisations are not in that position. And when I say most, what I'm referring to, particularly in the youth serving sector, is many organisations that look after minors and vulnerable adults are relatively small organisations. There are hundreds of thousands, probably millions of you, and the ability to be able to invest in a significant risk management function is challenging. So what we, not least because the information that's available is extremely limited, and you'll never be able to generate enough data to have reliable information around a risk that's relatively rare, fortunately. It may have doubled in the last 10 years, but I hope most organisations still won't have to deal with it, and I'd like less. That's the whole point of this exercise. So I'm going to move myself because I'm about to be in the way again, but you've seen the abuse up there, so I don't need to I can block that now. Stage 1 is the idea that you're going to assess your risks. So there are 3 stages to the system. The first is to assess your risks. And that involves establishing, first of all, a deep understanding of your organisation. And we walk you through the idea, and we think it's important that you go through this process, of understanding your organisation's business model. It's a really useful template for understanding an organisation in detail and why it does what it does and how it does what it does. What you get into, for example, are the activities that you as an organisation perform, and when you do it as a sexual abuse risk assessment, you also identify the activities that the minors and vulnerable adults in your care perform when they are working with you. So it enables you to look at different elements of your activities or your resources or relationships or value propositions or various other partnerships. It enables you to think about all of those different things from multiple perspectives. And so you can identify and develop a rich image of, first of all, everywhere and wherever and whenever minors and vulnerable adults may potentially be vulnerable to sexual abuse. And secondly, you also identify where your organisation's sexual abuse risks are in terms of disruption, lack of trust, financial consequences, legal consequences. All of those are much clearer once you've got a really deep understanding of your organisation down at a business model level. It also obviously enables you, so you've got a really clear picture of your risks. We then go into system customization. Once you've assessed the risk and you've identified where the vulnerabilities are and what the risks are, you can then develop controls, first of all, to identify, prevent, and respond to sexual abuse. And you can develop processes that manage your sexual abuse risks, and by making sure, first of all, that all the controls are actually happening, that the identification and the responses are happening effectively, and that the controls remain in sync with your organization and its risks. The third is actually doing all of that. I don't know if I can move that, I can't. The third element is actually managing the system itself. So you understand what you've got to build a system for, you build the system for it, and then you use the system, where you monitor your controls, you respond to incidents, you adapt to change, you learn, you keep your risks in your system in sync, and you continuously improve. And that adds up to the sexual abuse risk-aware culture, or in the way that's often described you'll see it often. That's how things get done round here, and things are teaching in schools, coaching in sports, and so on. Like I said at the very beginning, what you're looking to achieve is where everybody in your organisation who works with or for it, so outside the boundaries as well, understands. Through the process of doing the risk assessment, they understand what the risks are to minors and vulnerable adults, to the organisation, and to the individuals that work for the organisation. They understand what the controls are that have been put in place to make sure that the controls actually work, that incidents are responded to, that you're learning and continuously improving, and so on. And then they see that you're managing all of those things. And the way they see that is that you create the system management is that you usually have an individual, just like you did in that original org chart, but then instead of being responsible for background checks, policies and procedures, and training, they're now responsible for making sure that the risk assessment is kept up to date, that the controls are actually implemented, and that those two things are kept in sync. And that's not an insignificant job, but once you've got the assessment up and running, and once you call in others, the other team leaders in that org chart, and you get them to help you regularly review the assessment, to review the controls, and to make sure that incidents are being responded to, and that you're learning from them. And you invite others in those other sections of the org chart to join those meetings on a rolling basis, and you get them to participate in making decisions about, do we need to change our assessment? Do we therefore need to change our controls? Now they understand at a very deep level exactly how important sexual abuse risk management is to your organisation. And that's what establishes and maintains over the long term a sexual abuse risk aware culture. And that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to make sure that children and vulnerable adults are as well protected as possible, because the right decisions are being made all the time. We're trying to make sure that organisations are as well protected as possible, so they can continue to perform their missions of actually helping minors and vulnerable adults. And we're trying to ensure that the individuals that work with or for those organisations are also as well protected as possible, so they can continue to work for the organisations and continue to help the kids. That brings me to the end, and I hope it's been helpful. We'd obviously love to talk to you about how we can help you implement a sexual abuse risk-aware culture in your organisation. If you want to learn more about how we do that, go to bockrim.com. If you'd like to talk to me, if you go to bockrim.com/Bockrim Discovery Call, you'll come face to face with a calendar, which will enable you to choose a time to talk to me, and we'll talk through what you're trying to achieve, how we can help, and I hope that we'll have an interesting conversation. I'd love to meet you and find out what your major challenges with sexual abuse risk management are, and to see whether our system can help you with it. I hope this has been helpful. If you'd like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of them if you're on that platform. But I hope it's been helpful, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.